Jumping out of the confines of his Jeep, Mason Davis stretched, put his faithful hands behind his head, and gratefully received the rays of the morning sun on his face. Compared to the sultry warmth of his native Georgia, the mountain air here in Colorado was refreshing, faintly scented with spruce. The sky seemed clearer, and the stream flowing nearby shimmered with a cool blue. The journey home took Mason a long time. Arriving in Denver, he drove his Jeep along mountain serpentines. This maneuver seemed like a luxury, but for him, it was the only way to escape from his father, to disappear from his life as quickly as he burst into it. It was 2 hours from local roads to home along familiar paths, which was further from the watchful presence of his father, whom Mason truly loved, but with whom he did not stay long. It was worth it, Mason convinced himself, unbuttoning his city shirt in the wind. This limousine bull is perfect for the herd. To convince his father of his strength, Mason spent 2 whole weeks at home. John Davis Jr. insisted that the bull be released only after Mason was married. It was not easy to convince my father that none of the girls from Georgia touched his heart. As soon as the father realized this, the microphone ended successfully. Grinning slightly, Mason let go of the ends of his shirt and easily flew onto the porch of the house. Working on the land, he acquired not only physical strength, but also cat-like grace. His oily skin and strong body may have attracted attention, but he believes money plays a big role in the attention he receives from women. He knew about the traps that his father and younger brother had fallen into, and it was decided not to repeat their mistakes. Leaning back on the porch swing, Mason stood cautiously before the new day, the wind that loved the smell of adventure, and the freedom he valued above all else. Entering his family home, Mason felt that he was not alone. Instead of the usual freshness, the aroma of floral perfume hung in the corridor. He stopped, narrowing his eyes, as if expecting an intruder. And so, turning his head towards the dining room, Mason saw a woman. She stood near the buffet and looked at something carefully. "What are we doing here? Conducting an inspection?" Mason asked, not hiding his irony. The woman flinched in surprise and turned around abruptly, her long waves of hair spilling over her shoulders in rainbow waves. Her body was covered in a tight dress that emphasized every line of her figure, and her green eyes looked at Mason. The eye assessed, deep, bold, as if telling 1,000 inevitable stories. One glance was enough for Mason to understand that his father had outdone himself. What an amazing creature she is. "Hello," she said, holding out her hand and smiling. "My name is Melissa York." "Goodbye, Melissa York," Mason answered, not accepting his hand. "Tell your father that his efforts are in vain, and I would rather you weren't here when I return." "To your father?" Her sparkle in her eyes eclipsed her bewilderment. "Yes, to John Davis, who probably hired you for another attempt to arrange my personal life." Mason headed towards the stairs, abruptly taking off his shirt along the way. "I understand." Melissa shrugged, but an expression of stubbornness appeared on her face. "Did he tell you?" "Well, yes, I prefer brunettes with character and not people like you," Mason said aggressively, and his footsteps drowned out any possible answers. The door to his room slammed shut with contempt, leaving Melissa alone in the empty dining room. However, she was not the type of woman to give up so easily. Sometime later, Mason came downstairs, dressed in jeans, boots, and a shirt for work. Melissa was still in the dining room. He walked past her without looking at her, and took his hat off the rack near the kitchen door. "I'll go for a couple of hours. When I get back, I don't want to see you here," he said without turning around. "But how do I get back to the city?" Her voice sounded as if she was waiting for an answer. "On the way, you will meet a cowboy named Randy. He is a professional driver. He will help you," Mason said without retreating, and headed towards the stables. Having met his favorite, a majestic horse named Storm, Mason found him on a leash, ready to ride. Randy, his faithful assistant, stood nearby. Randy silently understood how his boss, a devotee of the bachelor life, reacted to such unexpected meetings. Even being happily married, he was always on Mason's side. "Randy, look," Mason grinned, letting go of the reins and galloping onto his horse. Storm seemed to sense Mason's desire to escape to the freedom that awaited him outside the ranch. During his absence, no one jumped on him, and the animal was full of strength and thirst for running. Raising gloomy dust, he rushed past the stables, and noticing the surprise on the faces of his workers, realized that his unprecedented return had clearly given them a lot of pleasure. Cowboys love to joke, especially when the jokes concern their only owner. Confident, Mason laughed out loud before heading off into the storm, leaving behind a house full of surprises. The storm carried Mason to the Davis Plateau, a surprisingly green corner of the mountainous terrain, Mason's favorite place on the ranch. He was usually the last to leave this place in the fall, and the first to return in the spring, as soon as the snow began to melt. But this year, the long winter kept him from enjoying the Davis Plateau before vacationing in Georgia. This region was once a meadow where cattle grazed. Now, most of these places were no longer part of the Davis Ranch. However, the Davis Plateau remains an untouched refuge, a reminder of the days of former glory. Ecologist Dr. Morgan convinced Mason to turn the small area into a nature reserve to help restore the flora and fauna. Dr. Morgan is confident the research will be useful for the conservation of other areas depleted by heavy hooves. Mason didn't need much convincing. Although he grew up in the city, he was always drawn to the Rocky Mountains and enjoyed every outing, rain or shine. He loved this land, and this love was mutual. Muddy Harper sat on the slope of the stream, where the sun's rays played, enthusiastically following the cold water with her fingers. The sun caressed her skin. Such a warm and cozy atmosphere made her forget about all her worries. She closed her eyes and imagined him. He will be indomitable as the wind, wise as the mountains, and exquisite in his simple splendor. He will look at her in such a way that she will feel like his constant companion. Muddy's dreams were interrupted by the sound of hooves. Maddie dispelled her dreams and slowly stood up, wiping her hands on her worn jeans. As she reached for a handful of food, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. She covered her eyes with her palm and looked into the distance. 2 horsemen rode out of the rocks towards a lonely sight. She straightened up and wiped her damp hands on the edges of her trusty jeans, mentally going through the provisions she had with her. Having decided to spend the short mountain summer as a witness on the Davis Plateau, Muddy had no intention of stocking up on food. She could hardly imagine that Mr. Davis's cowboys would frequent this place. But they appeared almost every day, swearing that they had never seen such splendor as her homemade bread and fried ham. Mason, returning from the mundane bustle of Georgia, stopped and greeted her with a wave of his hat. Muddy smiled back, recognizing him as a veteran of the ranch, an experienced cowboy named Tom. The second was young assistant Bill. The old-timers didn't mention the names of their colleagues if they had them, and she didn't even ask. "Good morning, Miss Muddy," Tom greeted, jumping off his horse. "How did the grain behave? They didn't sneak away during the night, did they?" Maddie smiled back at him. From the moment she told Tom about her mission on the Davis Plateau to monitor the growth of vegetation, he never ceased to sneer about it, suggesting that he bind the seeds so they don't fly away. "It's okay," she replied jokingly. "I keep my eyes open, especially when night falls, because that's when they try to escape." Tom laughed, knocking out a cloud of dust with his hat, the color of which playfully echoed the silver of his hair. "Don't worry, Miss Muddy, you're doing great. Mr. Davis is shocked that not a single grain went missing during his absence. We are all happy." It seems that the Georgian climate did not soften him, after his father gave him a fashion show for his girlfriends. Maddie just smiled sadly. She knew what it meant to resist her parents' wishes in the matter of marriage. Her parents, cunning anthropologists, wanted a secure marriage with one of their fellow explorers, a great explorer. They then go to Dr. Morgan to help her find a mate. Maddie went on a trip, but not in search of a groom. She traveled to see if the States would become her true home, and if she would find her place in this world, where her inner turmoil could find solace. "Hello, Miss Muddy," said the second cowboy, carefully getting off his horse and keeping a decent distance. "The mountains suit you. You bloom like an alpine flower." "Thank you," she smiled sweetly at Bill, a slender young guy. "How is your baby? Are your teeth sagging?" Bill sighed sadly. Somehow it was all stubborn. It seems the teeth passed him by. "But my Mabel asked me to convey my gratitude to you for the oil. This is a miracle cure. The baby feels much better." These young men seemed to radiate the unshakable energy and incomprehensible enthusiasm, characteristic only of those who had not fought face-to-face with nature in its wildest and most unpredictable manifestations. To them, the survival questions that Maddie asked herself every day were just theory from training courses. During the time Maddie spent at Professor Morgan's house waiting for the road to the Davis Plateau to open, she met many students. They came and went, left and came, like leaves heralding the arrival of greenery and warmth, or foreshadowing the imminent end of summer. But even being surrounded by the lively interest of youth, not a single glance, not a single word could evoke in her that feeling that could be called real attraction. There was no flash of flame, no hidden feeling that would make the heart beat faster. Maddie's resilience and perseverance was evident in her ability to withstand loneliness, while remaining equanimous in the face of her own thoughts and doubts. How could she not doubt her hopes for true love? If even in the bustle of student life she was never able to discover what some called the spark, that invisible flicker that connects two people in the fire of mutual attraction. However, in the depths of her soul, she continued to hope that someday, somewhere along her path, she would meet someone who could awaken in her soul a passion comparable to the mountain winds, capable of abruptly changing from gentle peace to wild, unbridled storm. And for now, sincere feelings remained with her, like a warm flame waiting in the wings to flare up into a full flame. Maddie returned her attention to the bubbling rush of coffee, feeling the tart aroma of the drink wafting around her, while Roger continued to talk about his adventures at the ranch and about his boss, Dick, who, according to him, was not only a skillful manager, but also a person with a sense of justice and straightforward honesty. And so the boss ordered her to settle in the lush meadows of the state. Roger finished his story, and the ringing blows of the axe joyfully echoed through the silence of the mountains. Maddie, casually amused by the story, secretly caught a vague thought that her attitude towards her boss Dick might have been different if she had known the man better. Perhaps there was some secret in his inaccessibility, neatly hidden behind the facade of a stern manager. "We will bring you as much firewood as you need," they assure. The cowboys finished their good deed, and after waving goodbye to Maddie, drove back to the ranch. Left alone, she finished preparing the coffee, ready to greet the thirsty with its rich aroma. A little Moroccan flavor in the Colorado wilderness was just what we needed to lift our spirits. Maddie set out plates of cookies, laid out fruit from the cowboy supply, and poured coffee. Inhaling the warm mountain air and contemplating the grandeur of the mountains, every day she understood more and more deeply that, despite the absence of the benefits of civilization, she was here, in the natural world, where she could be herself as much as possible. There was no need to hide behind masks of polite smiles or obey the harsh rules of city life. Lost in dreams, she did not immediately notice the approach of the horseman. As he got closer, Maddie recognized him as Mason, Dick's boss. His posture, ease of movements, and firm gaze made her heart beat faster, and the feelings she had just been thinking about flared up violently in her soul. "Hello, Miss Maddie," he said with a straight face. "I see you've settled in well here." His deep voice penetrated straight into her soul, but Maddie tried not to show her excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," she replied, continuing to arrange the cookies on the plate. "Please join. The coffee is freshly brewed and the cookies are still hot." Mason dismounted and approached the fire. His gaze fell first on her work, then on her face. It was clear that she was no less interesting to him than he was to her. On this day, in this small clearing in the middle of the mountains, with a stranger who was perhaps destined to become something more than just the owner of a nearby ranch, Maddie realized that waiting for love was only part of her journey, and how she will live and what she will fill her days with while she waits will determine her fate and purpose. Mason watched Maddie carefully as she sorted the cookies on a plate and poured him coffee. "As I see, you are having such a fun meeting here," Mason said. "Yes, we were discussing serious things here," Maddie answered boldly. "Like how Boss Dick can completely lose his mind over a mysterious beauty from the ranch." "Oh, sorry, I wouldn't want to be in his place. Too many problems with all these rumors and social expectations," Mason laughed, making it clear that he knows how difficult it is to be in the public eye. Maddie, you just didn't have to watch the races," Mason replied with a slight smile. "In the meantime, you can enjoy the beautiful day, right?" "Of course," Maddie laughed again. "And the coffee and food prepared here in the solitude of the mountains speaks for itself. We live for simple pleasures, Mason." Mason threw back his hat, casting a shadow on such expressive eyes, and slightly bowed his head in gratitude for the treat. So they continued to talk about many things, touching on the topics of starting a family, then the gossip of the work collective, absorbing the warmth of the sun and the light singing of birds in the valley. As the conversation flowed freely, a friendship began to form between Maddie and Mason, based on common ground: hearty coffee, fresh bread, and quiet enjoyment of the scenic view. The conversation became more free and inviting, and soon various stories from the ranch made Maddie forget about his initial inhibitions. Mason, sitting nearby and enjoying his coffee, listened attentively as she cheerfully told stories about her travel adventures. "You know," Mason began when the conversation died down for a moment, "I've always been a rancher, but your stories make me wonder how much more I have to see and experience in this world." "Oh, the world is big and full of surprises," Maddie replied, looking at him with a smile. "Every place I visited left an indelible mark on my heart." "I know," Mason nodded in agreement. "It's clear that you treasure these moments and memories very much." Maddie felt that being close to nature and company brought her peace and joy. In this remote corner of the world, where the sky seemed higher and the stars brighter, all the worries and bustle of life faded into the background. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, weaving its rays into a multicolored blanket of heaven, Mason began to talk about the future, about the plans and expectations he had for the ranch and his life. "Maddie," he said suddenly, holding out his hand to help her up, "how do you feel about coming to our ranch again? After all, there you can always find a new story for your wanderings." Maddie looked at his hand, then at him, and something soft and warm flowed into her chest. Perhaps new stories have begun to be written, perhaps right here and now. In response, she offered him her hand, and his bold invitation seemed to her the beginning of a new chapter in the book of her many-sided life.